grade, boys and girls. This is a special presentation put on by Mrs. Carroll and Mrs. Salome. They're going to be giving you information today about the old Longfellow School that we have been talking about this year, and also about the history of the town of Millville. Does anybody know why it's so important to talk about the history of Millville this year, especially this year? Elliot.
Because this is the 100th Centennial celebration.
Very good, thank you. So today you're going to be learning lots of things you might not have known about your own town, Millville, and about the old elementary school that boys and girls, maybe your parents or your grandparents attended. So you'll be learning about that as well.
Me too.
And Mrs. Salome and Mrs. Carroll as well went to that school.
Well, it's very, very nice for me to be here with Miss Salome and to greet all of the students in the 4th grade. I'm going to tell you a little bit, just a little bit about not just Longfellow School, but about the other schools of Millville. Some people don't know about those other schools. But our town of Millville, you know, is celebrating its 100th birthday this year. And there are so many things about Millville that you could learn at home or here or from talking to different people. I'm one of those people today who's going to tell you just a little bit about the schools of Millville. And I want to know what you know about Millville. Will you raise your hand if you know? Oh, first of all, I'm going to give you a little exercise. I want to make sure I can hear everybody. And I'm going to ask you to count with me. And we're going to count to 8. Are you ready? 1,
2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Remember that, 8. Okay. Now, by a show of hands, do you know what the last school what was the last school to be built in Millville? If you know the answer, raise your hand. The very, very last school to be built in Millville. Somebody right there in front of you. What do you think it is?
Millville Elementary School?
Yes, the Millville Elementary School was the last school built in Millville. And you might want to know, well, what was the first one built in Millville? All right, let me start here.
The Longfellow?
The Longfellow School? No, it is not the Longfellow School. And now we don't have to guess because I'm going to tell you, you could never guess. But I want to tell you that Millville is much older than 100 years. And Miss Salome is going to tell you all about that. Before we were the town of Millville, we were the village of Millville. And in the village of Millville, there were other schools. It was the first school built in Millville was the Longfellow Annex, and that is a little school building next to the Longfellow School, which is the police station. And it was the first school built in 110 years. But how would you know about, if you wanted to go out and find out about the other schools of Millville, how would you do that? Well, you could do some research, you could look at old maps, you could look at old school records, you could look at town books, or you could listen to someone, and I'm that someone today. I'm going to tell you that. Now another raise of hands. How many of you went to school here in the 1st grade? How many went to school in the 2nd grade? How many went to school here in the 3rd grade? And how many went to school in the 4th grade? Now put your hands down and listen carefully. How many of you went to school in 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, all 4 grades? Whoa, that's a lot of children. Okay, now let me put your hands down and let me tell you. I went to first grade in the the Bannigan City School. I went to the 2nd grade in the portable school. I went to 3rd grade back at Bannigan City School. And in the 4th grade, I went to Longfellow School, and I stayed there until I graduated from 8th grade, and then I went to Blackstone High School. Blackstone High School isn't there anymore. The Bannigan City School isn't there anymore. The portable school isn't there anymore. So there are schools, we had schools in Millville that you cannot see, but the records tell us that they were there. And that's what I want to tell you about today. There were 3 schools in Millville many, many, many years ago. They were very small schools. One was on the south side of the river at Providence Street. Does anybody know where Providence Street? All right. There's a little mystery for you. See if you can find out where that first little school was. Then there was another school on this side of the river, the north side of the river, and that school was on Lincoln Street. How many take a bus that goes through over Lincoln Street every day on their way to school? Only one goes Lincoln Street? Oh, several. Well, you go by that little school every day and you don't know it. And then there's another little old school in Chestnut Hill. And that's still there. That is the oldest school in Millville, and it is still there, and somebody lives in it. And the one on Lincoln Street that you go by, if you wanted to live in it, you could buy it, because today they're selling it. That's a house where people lived. And then the Longfellow School is still there, but it's what you might call our town hall. And that little annex that was built for the first and second kindergarten and first grade, that's still there, but it is the police station. So the story of our schools in Millville is a very mixed up one. I'm not going to answer any questions now, but we'll answer lots of them after, okay? So when you think of the history of Millville, you have to think of things that are still here, like some of our schools, and many of the things that have been gone for a long, long time. So let me just go back very shortly, because I want you to hear what Miss Salome has to tell you about how Millville came to be. If I wanted to go back and tell you, there were 3 old schools in Millville. And then they built another one in Chestnut Hill. How many have a bus that goes up Chestnut Hill Road? You go by that school every time you ride up and down Chestnut Hill Road. And you would never know it is a school because somebody lives there. It's been turned into a house. So from what I have learned, let's see how many schools do you think there were in Millville after I finished? How many do you think?
6.
6, okay. I know I could listen to a lot of questions, but I'm going to let you give the answer in just a minute. There was the Portable School, the Bannigan City School, the Longfellow School, the 3 little old schools, the new school in big school in Chestnut Hill, and the annex. Now, let's count again as we did at the beginning when I spoke to you. Want to start that count? 1,
2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
How many schools were there in the town of Millville? Oh, how many?
8.
8. That's something you can remember and you won't forget. And now I'm going to introduce Miss Salome, who's going to tell you and show you how Millville came to be on the map. Okay, Miss Salome?
Miss Carol's favorite number was 8. Mine is 9. And when we get to the end of the presentation, you're going to understand why 9 is my favorite number. I have to tell you, it's a treat to work with 4th grade children, because I'm used to working with 1st grade children who sit on the floor all the time. So this is a treat for me. I am here to tell you how your town of Millville came to be. And it's a very, very nice adventure. And I would like to take you on that adventure with me. But you have to bring with you 2 things. The first thing you have to do is you need to put on your thinking cap. Okay, will you do that? And the second thing you need to do is turn on your imagination and turn it up high.
Mine's over.
Are you ready to do that?
Yes.
Okay. And remember the number 9. Tell me what year you're in. What year is this?
2016.
Pardon me?
2016.
2016. I am taking you back almost 400 years, which is why we're dressed this way, because this is how people dressed 400 years ago. We are going back to not 2000, not the 1900s, not the 1800s, not the 1700s. We're going back to the 1600s. We're going back to the early 1600s, when this was called Massachusetts Bay Colony. Okay? And there were two towns up in the middle of Massachusetts Bay Colony called Braintree and Weymouth. And they were getting a little bit crowded. And so a group of people from both those towns decided that they would like to start a new village. Well, that's like you saying, well, I don't want to live in Millville anymore. I think I'm going to go someplace and set up a new village. Can you do that by yourself?
No.
No, you can't. And first of all, you need to get permission to do that. So this group of people got permission from the people who were in charge of Massachusetts Bay Colony, and they were given permission, and they were actually given a piece of land, and they could come and they could settle on that piece of land. Now, I'm going to show you what that piece of land looked like. You know the name of that town. What is it?
Mendon.
It's Mendon. You know, if you go all the way up Chestnut Hill till you get to that nice little bump, that little dip in the road and the sign, you go from Millville to Mendon, right? This is Mendon. Now I want you to take a very good look at the colorations on that map. What do you think the blue represents? Whether it's this or something like this. What do you think the blue is?
Rivers and ponds.
Rivers and ponds, anything that has water in it, right? What do you think all of this greenery is?
That's all the land.
I'm sorry?
That's all of the land that there is.
Say it again?
That's all of the land that they have.
That's the land. But what does the green represent? What is it? What do you think?
Grass and trees.
Forests and trees, exactly. What's missing? If you come from Braintree and Weymouth, which are way up here, and you're coming down here to live and settle, something very big is missing. What is it?
Houses.
Houses. Well, I guess what? Maybe we can go on the internet and look up some real estate and see which houses are for sale. Can we do that?
No.
Why not?
Because internet wasn't made in those times.
Because there's no way to do that. There is no internet. So, what do we have to do? What do we have to do?
Build.
We have to build our houses, but then that gives me another question. Where do we get this? Where do we get it?
From the trees.
From the trees, which means we have to go out, cut down the trees, bring in the lumber, build it, right? Short job, long job, or long job? Long. Very long. Very hard, too. We forgot something very important. Every day, we need what?
Food.
What?
Food.
Food. Where are we going to get that? I know. Stop and Shop.
No.
What do we do, Karen?
To get it from the garden and stuff.
What?
From the garden and stuff.
What are we going to have to do? We're going to have to plant it. Well, take a look outside. If we go outside to plant now, are we gonna do that?
No.
We're not planting, so where are we getting our food? We better learn how to hunt, and we better learn how to fish, because we're not getting any of this for a long time, are we? No. But you know what? This is what we wanted. So this is what we have to do. We have to work hard to build our houses. We have to learn how to hunt and fish to get our food. We have to do all of those things. And the first settlers in Mendon were basically sort of down here in the middle. And pretty soon, other groups of people came and began spreading out all around. Now, I'm going to go back to this end for just a minute, because there's something very important here that you need to remember. See this going down here? All the way down here. What do you think that is?
The Blackstone River.
Good for you. That is the Blackstone River. And that is very, very important in the development of the town of Millville and the towns in the ring around it. That is very, very important. Now, remember, when we first came to Mendon, we didn't want to be crowded up in Braintree and Weymouth. And now the same thing is happening here. There are a lot of people coming in. And to us it might not seem crowded, but to these people it did. So they began to start thinking about, you know, we don't want to have to travel from here to Mendon, to the middle of Mendon, to get what we need, or to see people, or to maybe go to church, or see how the town is run. We don't want to do that. So they decided they wanted to do exactly what the people way up here in Braintree and Weymouth wanted to do, which was to start their own village. So they made a lot of noise about that, and they began thinking about it, and pretty soon one group of people who lived at the outer edges of this map decided that that was exactly what they wanted to do. So they did exactly what we did. They went to the people who could give them permission. They said they wanted to start a town of their own, and they did that. And that town, the first one to leave Mendon, was this town right here. You see it?
Yeah.
Say out loud what it is.
Bellingham.
There goes Bellingham. And it only took 52 years for that to happen. Now, you know what it is when you're a part of a group and someone does something different in the group, everybody else starts thinking, maybe that's not a bad idea. Maybe it's time we should have our own town too. Why do we have, if we live up here, why do we have to come all the way down here to go to church or to see people? Or way up here? Not a bad idea. So the first time it took just 52 years, and that happened in 1719. And then, just 8 years later, in 1727, the people over here decided they wanted to do exactly the same thing. And now we go from being the village of, what's that?
Oxbridge.
To the town, independent town of Uxbridge. So look what's happening to the town of Mendon. It's getting what?
Smaller.
Right, it's getting smaller. And don't think this idea is going to die, because it's not. All the other people are thinking, not a bad idea. 37 years later comes the town of Upton. And Mendon is getting smaller still. After Upton comes this one. Took 37 years, but we get Northbridge. We get Northbridge. And now, Mendon, look what's left of Mendon. Just this. Right? And now we have new towns: Bellingham, Uxbridge, Northbridge, and Upton. Next one, in 1780, Milford. Whoa. Smaller still. Doesn't take much longer. And if you remember what Miss Carroll said, she said that Blackstone and Millville were one town. Millville was a village in Blackstone. So the next thing that happened was Blackstone and the village of, and it's a village of Millville, but it's still a part of Blackstone, went, and the last one to go was this one. You got it?
Hopedale.
Last one to go to Hopedale, and look at what has happened in Mendon, and that is the town of Mendon now. So it went from being this whole big thing to dividing off all of the other towns, and they all became their own town and all independent. Now, strange things were happening given the times here. I'm going to show you this word. What is it?
Power.
When you see power, and when you think about power, what do you think of? First thing you think of usually is something like this. What do you think of? Someone has power.
Muscle.
Muscle. What is that? Give me another word.
Ruling over someone.
Okay. Give me one word begins with an S.
Strength.
Strength. But here's another meaning for power. Power makes things happen. I'm going to show you something. What's that?
Power.
What kind?
Electricity.
Electrical power, right? That's electrical power. But there are a lot of other kinds of power beside this and that. There is power from the
Sun.
which you should be seeing around Millville lately, because what's going up on people's roofs to take advantage of the power of the sun?
Solar panels.
Solar panels. That's power. This is power.
Water.
Water. You never knew water was power?
No.
Water is power. Did you ever see a water wheel
Yes.
that moves water around? That creates power. What's that? Wind power. There are many, you only think of power as electricity, but you have the power of the wind, you have the power of the water, you have the power of the sun. So first of all, power, you have to think about power. And then you have to think about this thing that is going down, and if you look at it, it runs parallel to that Blackstone River you told me about. What was it?
Train.
What was it?
Train.
It was the, well, what do you call it? What do you call these things? Railroad.
Tracks.
Yeah, it was the railroad that came through. So you had, think about it now, you had the power of the river and you had the power of the railroad. That was coming through. So things were changing. How did, up until Blackstone and Millville and the other towns started to separate, how did people make money? Had to do something to make money. What did they do? Way in the back there.
Work. They had someone could hire them to harvest their crops.
They would have to go out and they could either plant their crops and have someone harvest them or sell them. So people, in order to get money, mostly use the land. Now, because of the power of the water and the river and the power of the railroad, they began to think that maybe they didn't always have to farm, that they could make things. So they built mills. They used the power to run the machinery in the mills. They used the railroad to take out what they made. And things began to change from being a farming community, farming area, to what we call manufacturing. And that means just making things. Doesn't matter what it is. And I'm going to introduce something to you that you'll learn about a lot later when you're in school, but it means the same thing. This is where the Industrial Revolution began, where people decided that maybe there was another way to do things. And that's why people went into making things instead of just farming to get what they needed. But that's a very big concept for a little bit later. But that's what was introduced, and it was this area. And you notice, there goes the Blackstone River. There were the mills in Northbridge, in Uxbridge, in Millville, and in Blackstone. Right down here. And you don't know it, but if you go to the library in Millville, on Main Street in Millville, there's nothing back there now, but there used to be mills there that made everything from cotton, felt, rubber, what else did they make? That materials?
Yeah, wool.
Wool. They made different kinds of material and rubber. And they could get it out of Millville just by putting it on the railroad and sending it wherever it wanted to go. Yes,
I think I know why your favorite number is 9.
you do.
Yeah,
Tell us.
because there's 9 towns.
Yes. Now, the only place on this whole map, well, there were 2. Mendon actually couldn't go anywhere, right? It's not going to separate. But what's left that really didn't separate on its own? Didn't go any place by itself? What's the only town that didn't go anywhere by itself?
Mendon.
Nope. Beside Mendon. One more. Remember I told you Bellingham went, then Uxbridge went, and then Upton, and then Northbridge, and then Milford and Blackstone, and Millville was a village, Blackstone, and then Hopedale. What's the only place that didn't go anywhere by itself?
Millville.
Millville didn't go anywhere by itself. So, you know what I said earlier, a good idea never goes out of style. So the people who lived in Millville decided, hey, we don't want to be part of Blackstone anymore. They didn't think they were being treated fairly. They didn't think they got an even distribution of everything that was going on, so they decided they wanted to separate. And they did. Took a while. They had to do what everybody else had to do. They had to request permission. They had to get permission. They had to agree on what they wanted to do, and they finally got permission to become a town all by itself on May 1st, 1916. Which is why we're having this great big Centennial celebration. That's what the word centennial means. It means 100 years, 100. So that's why we're doing it. It took us a little while to get to the idea of it, but we finally did get there. We got there, we managed it. They decided that they wanted to do it, and you know, the first time they requested permission, they got, the answer was no. The answer was no, you can't do it. But they didn't give up. They presented it again, and the answer was yes. That is why we are having this Centennial celebration. That is why we're celebrating 100 years, even though the town of Millville goes back to the 1600s, because remember, we were part of Mendon, and that was in the mid-1600s. So even though we are only 100 years as an independent town, we go back as far back as Mendon did, when those people came and decided they wanted their own village. Now, this might seem to you like a big story to tell, but it really isn't, because you're all going to get this. It shows you, what's that? Mendon. And then, if you turn the page, you get everything that came out of Mendon. And what does it say up at the top there? It says Mother Mendon, because that's what we call Mendon. We call Mendon Mother Mendon because all of these, what's at the top there? Sister towns came from Mendon. So you're going to get this to take home with you so that you can today or tomorrow or next week during vacation, you can tell the story of Millville, and you can do it. So let's just see if you can. First of all, people wanted a new town. Got permission, they were given land, they came down, and it was called Mendon. They had to build their own houses, hunt, and
Fish.
they had to hunt and fish. Then they were able to plant
Their food.
plant their food, have their village. Everything's going nicely until somebody decided they wanted to have a new town for themselves. They got permission to do it, and the first one that went, do you remember? Over there, the biggie, right over on the side, Bellingham. From Bellingham, next one to go was over here,
Uxbridge.
Uxbridge. Very good. After Uxbridge goes
Northbridge.
no,
Upton.
Upton. After Upton goes, Elizabeth, right next to Upton. No,
Oh,
no. Came North, next came Northbridge, next went Blackstone, and what was a part of Blackstone? Millville. Next goes, and last,
Millville.
nope, forgot.
Redford.
What's under Milford?
Oakdale.
Hopedale, and then Millville finally got it. And what year did Millville go?
May 1st.
100 years from 2016, 100 years back.
1916.
1916, do you remember the date? The date?
December 12th.
Oh, that's today's date, sorry. You remember the date of the separation of Millville from Blackstone? The day of the parade?
May 1st.
May 1st. May 1st. Okay, now you can go home today and you can tell that story, don't you think? I think so too. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'm sure that Ms. Carroll or I will try to answer them. Oh, before I forget, someone, and I will give you her name, Mrs. Koskowski, made this wonderful quilt of the map for us. And someone in the town of Millville is going to go home with this wonderful quilt at some point. And on the back, she has quilted a very short version of the story that Miss Carol and I just told you. And someone is going to have this in his house. It's very, very nice. And it too tells the story. And your map will help you tell the story too. Thank you.
There had to be very friendly relations between all of the people living in Mother Mendon, because just as Millville was once part of Blackstone, Northbridge was once part of Oxbridge. So when Oxbridge first split, it was this big. And then later, they divided. The same thing happened one time. Hopedale was part of Milford. And a long time after Milford was settled, Hopedale wanted to be. They had a hope. That's where their name Hopedale comes from. They had a great hope that one day they would be separated from Milford. So this is a story of those few people who came, as Miss Salome said, into Mendon to settle a town, and out of it came how many towns?
What's the name? What's the number?
What's the number of towns? Say it out loud.
9.
How many schools were there?
8.
Okay, well, we have that straight. There are not 8 towns, there are 9 towns. And there's many more stories from this that could be told. But you wanted to know if there were any questions. Does anybody have questions?
Jacob?
Do you know which class buried the time capsule?
What's that, please?
Do you know which class buried the time capsule?
Do we know which class buried the time
Yes,
capsule?
it was a class of 1980. And you asked a question, I'm going to give you the answer. It was a very unusual class because it was happening at a time in Millville when our schools were very crowded. And when they were in the 4th grade, and it was time for them to go to 5th grade, there was no space in the Longfellow School. So we had to rent space in the Blackstone High School. So the grade 4 class of 1980 did not graduate from the 8th grade in Millville. They graduated from the 8th grade in the village of Millville in the town of Blackstone. So that was a very famous class, 1980. They were the last ones to have a graduation as the 8th grade. Remember, what is the date of the parade? Say it out loud.
May 1st.
And when did Millville separate from Blackstone?
1916.
And what was the date?
May 1st.
Look at all you've learned already. They separated. Millville was the only town that separated from another town. All the others divided, but Millville separated. And Mr. Logan told you that when they first tried, the legislature in Boston said no. And then the next time they tried, the legislature said yes. And when they went to go forth, the governor vetoed. The governor said, no, you cannot do it. And so, the next morning, the separation committee went to Boston, and they got enough friends in the legislature to vote yes. And so for the second time, Millville had to have a special vote to become a town. And this is going to surprise you. We were not going to be the town of Millville. When they asked to be separated from Blackstone, the people of Millville voted they wanted the town to be called Columbus. So you almost lived in Columbus, Massachusetts. But when it came down to the very end, they decided they wanted Millville. And I will tell you a little story about the Millville Elementary School. When the school was finished, the question came up, what was it going to be named? And they, among the others asked, the children at the Longfellow School, all 8th grades, which asked, did they want the school to be called Longfellow? Because this school was built of brick, just like the Longfellow School had been built. And guess what they said? No. They wanted Longfellow School to stay Longfellow School. And they wanted this to be Millville's elementary school, because this was the biggest school that Millville had. And it was the second school built in Millville.
How did Millville get its name?
How did Millville get its name? That's a very good question. When the people of Mendon, any part of Mendon, wanted to have their grain ground, this was in the 1700s, they would take it right down here, right exactly where my cane is pointing. Because they're at the mill, they're at the river, and the power of the river turned the grist mill. And it was on an island in Millville. Many people do not know that Millville has an island right in the middle. How many school buses go over Central Street? How many of you ride over
the
Central
bridge.
Street? That's all that goes Central Street. You go over the island every time you cross Central Street. And Samuel Thompson had built a mill on the island. And to get the farmers would come with their bags of wheat and bring it down to the river, and he had a little ferry that went from the banks of the river to the island. He would take their bags of wheat and he would grind it in his grist mill. And how do I know that? Because we have the stone from Samuel Thompson's grist mill. It was taken out of the river in 1930s. It had been there since 1727. And it's right out in front of the Longfellow School building. And there it says for everybody to read, Seth Thomas Grist Mill, 1727. So you will hear all kinds of stories, but some stories you can see, and you can see the story of the grist mill. And that's how Millville started to get its name. Anytime there was a little mill that went up, a sawmill or a grist mill, a few more families would move in. And they started calling it the village at the mills. And you can read it in the old books. If you read old history books, you will read that people took their grain and then wood down to the sawmill and grist mills at the village in Millville. And so they turned it around finally and called it Millville. It was Mill Village, and then it became Mill. And that's how some of our, and you, right there on the river, you can see there was a huge mill in 1828. And someday I'll come with Miss Salome, we'll show you the picture. And it's carved right in the stone, 1828. That was the stone basis of the mill. Now let's talk about the Blackstone River for a minute. When those people came to Mendon, they looked for places for, as you said, the ponds and the streams, and even the little brooks were important. And then they found the Great River, and that was the name they called it. It was called the Great River. You are awesome up there in the corner. I love that awesome shirt you're wearing. It was called the Great River. Now you would have to find out, when did it become the Blackstone River? How did Blackstone get its name? Blackstone took its name from a very famous man, William Blackstone. And that's a whole other story that we could tell you. We could tell you the whole story of how the name Blackstone came to Blackstone, how it came to the river, but the Blackstone River is not named for the black stones that are at the bottom of the river. And it was not named for the town of Blackstone because the river was there before Blackstone. It was named for a man who did good work, and his name was William Blackstone, and they started calling it Blackstone's Valley. And then pretty soon it was Blackstone's River, and pretty soon it was Blackstone River. And how did Longfellow School get its name? That's a question of Sarah.
Did it get a name from the man who built it?
Was named for a man who lived here.
No, it wasn't. No, and no, I'll tell you, when Millville Elementary School was given the name, and I don't know whether this is in writing, but the committee who built the school and the committee who turned it over to the town, they all voted that Millville Elementary School will never be changed. It will never call the William Blackstone School. Or it would never be called after any other person, because the children in Millville, when we built the school, they chose to call it the Millville Elementary School. Because sometimes when they would say to people would ask, what school do you go to? They'd say, I go to Longfellow School. And the person asking the question would have to say, where is that? So they decided if they kept Millville in the name, that people would not say, where is the Millville Elementary School? They might say, where is Millville? But they would not say, where is the Millville Elementary School? Any other questions?
Did Millville and Milford have a big thing in manufacturing because both of their names started with MIL?
No, that's why that's why Millville got its name, because of the mills. Someday we could come, everything you speak of, we could show you in pictures. They were over 1,000 men who worked in the Blackstone and the Millville, the U.S. Rubber Company. The Blackstone River, standing at the bridge, was lined with mills. And some of them were in the 1800s, and they were huge mills. They were not just little small mills, they were huge mills. That's how Millville got its name, after the mills of Millville. Sarah?
Why did they almost change it to Columbus?
Say that again?
Why did they almost change it to Columbus?
Well, that's a very good question, because at that time there was the Knights of Columbus was a big organization in the St. Augustine Church, and there were so many people going to St. Augustine's Church at the time that they thought it would be nice to name the church after Christopher Columbus, and so it was going to be Columbus, Mass. In fact, I have that in writing. The very first time they went to the state and asked if they could separate from Blackstone, they wanted to create the new town, Columbus. How would you like to live in Columbus, Massachusetts? How many would like to live in Columbus?
No.
Good for you.
Because there's nothing.
It's Millville, Massachusetts. And I think that's, anything else?
I was just going to say, did you realize that there is a village in Millville?
No.
Which I suppose at some point could decide it would want to go off on its own. Do you have any idea what the village is? Think about where you live, you know, where, what?
Plymouth?
No?
Columbus?
No, Chestnut Hill.
Let me just ask you this. Could I ask them this? Sure. Remember I told you about the schools, and I told you where there was one?
Chestnut
There
Hill.
was one on the south side of the river near Providence Street. There was another one on the north side like Lincoln. There was another one in Chestnut Hill, and then they built another one in Chestnut Hill. I wonder why they did that. Why do you think?
Because maybe they didn't want to move the bus rotation, or they could have wanted to keep all the traffic along other streets for kids getting dropped off by their parents. They just have one road.
That's very good, except at that time, and I'm glad you brought that up, there were no buses. And the children walked to school. But you are right. Now you can tell them the name of that other village.
Chestnut Hill.
Chestnut Hill.
Chestnut Hill, there was a school there, and were Chestnut Hill students with you in the Longfellow School? They were with me too. They would come by bus. The rest of us had to walk. It didn't matter where you lived downtown. If you lived way up on Providence Street, either way, you would have to walk to the Longfellow School. But if you lived up in Chestnut Hill, you rode a bus to go to school. And you stayed for lunch while I got to go home.
That's what I was going to say. If you lived at the end of Ironstone, wherever you lived, you went home for lunch and you came back. And the bell would ring there was one bell that would ring one time. And that meant you had 5 minutes to get to school after you had your lunch. But when Blackstone separated from Mendon, or divided from Mendon, there were 5 villages. Millville was one, Chestnut Hill, Blackstone, and there were 2 other little villages in Blackstone. The reason why Millville succeeded was because we had the power of the Blackstone River. That's what the power of the river is what made Millville what it was then.
The land on which the school is built, all up here when I was a little girl, were dairy farms. They had cows here, right?
Chestnut Hill was farming and dairy.
That's all that was up here. A lot of these, well, very few of these houses were here.
Oh, no.
McLaughlin's house was here, the farmhouse was there, but there weren't any houses on this street, on Thayer Street at all. It was all dairy farms, cows, milk.
How many towns are on our map?
9.
Which one was the mother town?
Mendon.
Which was the last town to separate?
Hopedale.
Millville.
Millville.
Oh yeah.
Millville. It sounds like it was Hopedale. And I think now we have some distributions to make.
Now you can go home and you can tell the story yourself.
My friends, what do we say?
Thank you.
Let's give a round of applause.
Thank you.